interesting texture that's happening here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the Sketch and Wash here where I've got these leaf textures. I'm going to use a Sketch and Wash like a brush because I can see some negative space areas that are pretty dark, some light areas. Obviously out here where it's mostly black, I'm going to have a good amount of that graphite. So I'm just kind of softening that, but I just want this to be loose and brush strokey. The purpose of wet media is exactly that, for it to be loose and wet and transitional. So that's the background up against the edge of that particular flower right there. So I'm just kind of texturizing those leaves. I'm leaving white because I'm going to use the brush to create some of the middle value grays that are in there. Now obviously the background here I've got mostly dark. Okay, so that's what this extra dark scribble is. That's my 6 value. Now as I get into here, I can see I've got a mid value along there. So what value do I kind of have around that part? That looks like a 2 value. So where I have that 2 value going along here, I'm going to put that 2 value in with the pencil nice and light. All right, so this value here, I'm going to show you a trick on that, something that you can do to create that nice super soft smooth stuff. All right, a lot of textural stuff happening there. This is a little bit darker, the stem. Now, what I'm going to do in this area of this leaf is I'm not going to use the graphite directly on here to create that soft gray. What I'm going to do is on a piece of scrap paper, all right, I'm just going to take a piece of scrap white paper. Scrap any paper, but watercolor paper, it does work best. So I'm going to take this scrap piece of watercolor paper and I'm just going to use it like a paintbrush palette. So I'm putting some graphite down on it. And when I go to paint this area here, obviously I need to be careful around those areas of light, those highlights, but there's a trick I'm going to show you. First trick is going to be filling that space with a pale gray. So to make a pale gray in here, here's what you're going to do. You're going to work with a technique called wet and wet. So the first thing I'm going to do is just with clean water, I'm going to wet a certain area of this leaf, going right over top of the graphite that I transferred here, all right, trying not to hit the flower petal. So it's just clean water in there. Okay, now I'm going to take my same square brush and over here I'm going to use this like paint, like I'm picking it up. And if you look at the value of that, a little bit more water, I'm getting a nice pale gray. And when I put wet into wet, okay, I've got that clean water in there, I can put in that nice, smooth, pale gray. Come over and grab a little more. Nice, smooth, pale gray in that entire area. Now, obviously, I need to get a little bit darker, so that's fine. I can take a little bit more water and a little bit more graphite. And as I come back in, I say, all right, maybe I'm getting a little too dark, so I'm just going to pull this graphite from here down. Pull it down, overlapping it, getting it a little bit darker, closer to the value that I need. That's the beauty of a wet and wet technique, is you can manipulate the value by pulling it across the surface. So I've got a pretty good medium value for this part of the leaf. But I need to get those light values back, right? Those little vein shapes. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a clean brush with a small point, and I'm going to lift. Lifting technique is just literally that. I'm pulling the clean brush and I'm lifting the graphite off of the paper. See how that's lifting it right out? That's what you want to do. Lift the graphite while it's still wet. Just lifting it off of there. And that could be necessary in a lot of different places, but you have to do it while it's wet, because once this dries, you're not able, and even areas of value, right? If I need to lighten up and texturize areas, I can lift areas of gray, larger areas of gray out. Like over here, I've got some highlights. And while it's still wet, like right here, here's a highlight. I can lift that highlight out and create an accurate representation of what I'm trying to accomplish. All right, so now that I'm looking at it, I can see that there are some darker values of gray in here. So instead of me coming in and trying to shade in there with the pencil, where I lifted the colors out, all I'm going to do is the same thing that I did before. Just take a small brush, a little bit of my source material over here. Try to get a little less water now. So I got a nice medium gray. All right, so I can see like through here. Now that's a dry surface I'm putting it on. This is called a dry overlap. You can see when I put that dry overlap on, I get a little bit more. I can add some more texture, even softness in some areas, going over top of an already dry surface. All right, and it really creates some nice accents. Though throughout here, if I wanted to do it a little bit smoother, right, because all through here there's some more darker tone, I can just get a good amount on the brush and just put that throughout. Clean my brush, get a little bit more water, and soften that edge. Yeah, so it's creating some textures. Now, in this area here, where I got a lot of chaotic things happening, right, there's really no pure white. There's a couple little flashes of zero value in that. I have a lot of white here. What I want to do, though, here is, with my brush, I want to keep it textural and loose. Okay, so I'm going to try a square brush in this area, take a little bit of the water off, and I'm just going to stab the brush around a little bit. So I'm just kind of bouncing the brush around, picking up some of the darks. All right, I'm not trying to paint around everything. This is kind of called a dry brush technique. And what you see is, you see how the bristles start to pull apart? Right? That's a great textural method for creating layering as well as depth. So with that dry brush, you can see now how the leaves are starting to look like leaves, but I'm not trying to sketch around every single leaf. And then, of course, out here where they have the darker darks, where I kind of have some variations of pick up some highlights in the back, I can kind of do the same thing. I can just pull this across this way, and, you know, as I get over to some of those areas, it'll lighten up. Right? Kind of pull some across and build those textures throughout the remainder of the space. Even, you know, out here, I can just use that little bit that I've got on the brush, kind of dance it around and create some interesting textures that way. In the area over here, where I've got those really soft values in there, I'm going to use the small brush again. Even though this is really textural, the values are smooth. So I'm going to, again, use my source. And up against light edges, for example, you see the softness on the edge of that value? That's right along here. I didn't sketch that in. But I want to just, along the edge of that, I want to create a boundary of water where the white is. so that when I come in now with this light gray, right up against that edge of water, watch what happens. It creates a fade and kind of blends into the water. So it goes from here and kind of softens itself into the water. So now when I hit the dry paper, I've got a nice sharp edge where I need the sharp edge. And I'm just kind of dancing the brush around. Just kind of creating the texture that I see up against that line. Over here, it's the same thing. There's that strong white highlight, and then it's a little bit darker, so I just come back to my source here. I've got that white value that I need to make sure I maintain. So on a dry surface, you're able to get nice, clean, sharp edges. All right, see that nice, clean, sharp edge that created the highlight right there. And then, of course, behind that highlight is a shadow. All right, so you can see I'm starting to develop that color. Obviously, I still need to come back in and get a little bit darker in some areas, so I don't need to get too much more water on the brush. But once this area dries a little bit, see if I come in while it's still wet, I'm just pushing around the graphite that I put down. But if I give it a chance to dry like I did up here, you can come in and you can get a nice crisp edge and continue to add texture that way. Some of the areas here, also, if you notice what I did, I just used clean water, clean brush, to put in some of those 1 values of those areas around the circles. And I just took the tip of my brush and I can just dance my brush around and kind of put those light values in like I did here. Some of those shapes come around and has some uniformity to it, so that when I do go in and I put in my those values go right around it.